I forget that feeling like you want to really dig into something, like a topic or an event or whatever, but without drowning in a sea of details or opinions.
Right, like you want that deep understanding, but also you don't want to get like totally lost in the weeds.
Exactly. That's what we're all about here. We take really well-researched stuff and we pull out the core, like the aha moments, the stuff that makes you feel like, okay, I get it now, without that overwhelmed feeling.
Yeah, cutting through the noise,
Yeah,
getting to what really matters.
precisely. And today we're diving deep into a book that does just that. And it's about a story many of us think we already know, Hallie Rubenhold's The Five. I mean, most of us have heard of Jack the Ripper, right? The infamous figure from Victorian London.
Oh yeah, for sure. But this book, it really flips the script on that whole familiar narrative.
It really does. It's like instead of chasing the phantom, she turns the spotlight onto the lives of the five women who are considered his canonical victims: Marianne, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly.
And the really interesting thing here is the killer himself is barely even mentioned.
It's a deliberate choice, right, to
Yeah.
kind of shift the focus away from the killer and more towards these women's lives.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about moving beyond just the horror of their deaths and really exploring who they were,
Yeah.
the things that shaped their lives, the societal context, all the things that kind of contributed to their vulnerability.
Because I think the established idea and like almost a key part of the whole Ripper legend is that all five women were sex workers. But Rubenhold challenges that pretty directly, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a huge part of her work. Through her research, and it's very meticulous research, she argues that for at least three of these women, that sex worker label,
Yeah.
it's just historically inaccurate, or it doesn't even begin to, like, cover the complexities of their lives.
So it's much more nuanced than that.
So much more. And even for the women who may have engaged in, let's say, survival sex work, she really pushes us to see the bigger picture.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this, starting with Marianne Polly Nichols. What did Rubenhold's research tell us about her background?
Okay, so Polly, she was born into a working class family in 1845. And for a while, she had some stability. She was married to a printer. They had 5 children together. But things took a real turn when she separated from her husband, largely due to his alcoholism.
A real turning point. What were the challenges she faced after that?
Well, it was rough. She ended up in this cycle of workhouses and shelters and trying to find some kind of domestic work. Tragically, she lost custody of her children and often found herself without a place to sleep, you know, relying on alcohol and whatever temporary lodging she could find.
And workhouses, for listeners who might not know, they were basically institutions offering shelter, but in exchange for labor. And they were often a last resort, right, with a lot of social stigma attached.
Oh, definitely. It was not a place you wanted to end up.
And the crucial point that Rubenhold makes is that there's no actual solid evidence linking Polly to prostitution, right?
That's it. I mean, despite that being the prevailing narrative, Rubenhold suggests that Polly may have just been desperately trying to find shelter the night she died. She was turned away from a lodging house because she didn't have the, like, few pennies needed for a bed.
Just a few pennies.
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking. So the key takeaway here is that her vulnerability stemmed from poverty and lack of support, not necessarily from sex work. And that goes directly against what a lot of people assume about the Ripper narrative.
Yeah, that's a big one. Okay, let's move on to Annie Chapman. Her story seems to be marked by a lot of hardship and loss as well.
Oh, absolutely. Annie, she was born into a family that had a bit more social standing,
Yeah.
and she ended up marrying a coachman. So
Yeah.
initially, they had a fairly comfortable life, but then tragedy struck when one of their children died from meningitis, and then another child was born with disabilities. And this took a real toll on Annie's mental health.
It sounds just devastating.
It was, and eventually her marriage fell apart.
So then what happened?
After the separation, the financial support stopped. And like Polly, she became part of that marginalized, outcast population of London. She was moving between lodging houses, workhouses, and the streets.
And again, while survival sex work may have been a possibility for her, Rubenhold's focus is elsewhere.
Yes, exactly. The emphasis is on the impact of all the trauma, the illness, the addiction. It's about seeing her as a woman struggling with all these incredibly difficult personal challenges rather than just defining her by, the sex work.
Right. Okay, let's talk about Elizabeth Stride. Her background as an immigrant adds a whole other dimension to her story.
It really does. Elizabeth Gustav's daughter, as she was born, She was originally from Sweden, and she immigrated to London, married a ship's carpenter.
Interesting.
Yeah, and get this. She actually survived a shipwreck when she was younger, so, she carried that trauma with her.
Wow, that's intense.
It is. And while there are records of, like, minor arrests for prostitution earlier in her life, Rubenhold argues that her later life was not defined by it.
So what did her life in London look like?
Well, she was often living in lodging houses. But despite her poverty, she was known for being very clean and tidy. She was even involved in some charitable activities. It's a story that really highlights the challenges for immigrants, especially women without strong family or social connections in Victorian London.
So multiple factors at play leading to vulnerability. And in Elizabeth's case, Rubenhold suggests that she may have simply been resting or walking when she was attacked, not necessarily engaged in sex work at that moment.
Yeah, it really challenges our assumptions about why she was targeted.
Okay, let's talk about Catherine Eddowes. Her story seems to point to a different kind of struggle, potentially tied to her artistic side.
Interesting, right? Catherine was known to be intelligent and creative. She even wrote ballads and songs. She had various jobs throughout her life, lived with a man named Thomas Conway, and they had several children together.
So a family life as well.
Yeah, but her later years were really tough. She was dealing with chronic poverty and alcoholism, which led to a lot of instability.
So what was going on with her the night she was murdered?
So she had actually been arrested for public drunkenness, and she was released from police custody in the early morning hours. Rubenhold suggests that she probably ended up sleeping outdoors after that because, well, she had nowhere else to go, and that might have made her a target.
And again, no hard evidence to suggest sex work was her primary occupation.
Exactly. It really complicates the picture we often have of these women.
Okay, finally, let's talk about Mary Jane Kelly. She seems to be the one whose story most closely aligns with the traditional narrative.
Yeah, Mary Jane is the most enigmatic of the five, and she's the only one with clear evidence of engaging in sex work. She was younger than the other victims and described as quite attractive. But her background is a bit murky. She often gave different names and stories about her past.
So it's hard to piece together a complete picture.
Definitely. We know she lived with a man in Whitechapel and was struggling financially. It's very likely she turned to sex work for survival. And her murder was by far the most brutal of the five. And that fact, along with her being a sex worker, is often emphasized in traditional accounts. But, Rubenhold still emphasizes that Mary Jane's life was more complex than that. It shouldn't be reduced to just that one aspect.
Right, there's always more to the story. And it's so striking how each of these women's individual stories, when you really dig into them, are so distinct, shaped by this complex web of factors. It really challenges that simple, singular label.
It totally does. And what's so fascinating about Rubenhold's approach is that she uses these individual stories to shed light on the bigger picture, the social landscape of Victorian London. These weren't just isolated tragedies. They were really symptoms of something much larger, something systemic, the little precarious position of women at that time, legally, economically, socially.
Absolutely. And think about the legal limitations on women back then. Like, they had so little control over their own money, so their economic vulnerability was huge, and it contributed directly to them ending up in these precarious living situations and being open to exploitation.
Exactly. And the safety nets that we have today, they were basically non-existent back then. If a woman lost her husband or her job, or she struggled with addiction, there was almost nowhere to turn. So, as Rubenhold argues so convincingly, these women were victims of way more than just a single killer. Poverty, addiction, misogyny, systemic neglect, they all played a role.
It's a powerful social critique, so the book goes beyond just correcting the historical record. It's making a statement about society itself.
It is forcing us to confront these uncomfortable truths about Victorian England. And it's saying if we really want to understand what happened, we have to understand the lives that were lost, the world they lived in. We can't separate the two.
This must have been a pretty controversial take, especially for people who spent years studying the Ripper case.
Oh, it was. There were definitely some ripperologists who pushed back against it, who didn't like this challenge to their long-held assumptions. But the book also got a lot of praise, both from literary and academic circles. People really recognized the depth of her research and her empathetic approach to the subject matter.
And it won some pretty major awards.
Yeah, it won the Bailey Gifford Prize for nonfiction, which is a really big deal. And I think more broadly, it's contributed to this movement we're seeing in true crime, where the narrative is becoming more victim-centered.
That's so important. So to wrap this up, what would you say is the core message of the five? The big takeaway you want listeners to walk away with?
The core message is about reclaiming these women's humanity, their individual stories. Because for over a century, they've been reduced to, like, nameless victims in this sensationalized murder mystery. And Rubenhold brings them back to life. She gives them back their dignity, their agency, their individuality, and she does that by shifting the focus away from the gruesome details of their deaths and onto the realities of their lives. It's about understanding how they lived, the challenges they faced, and what made them vulnerable. It's not about how they died.
It's a really powerful shift in perspective,
Yeah.
and it aligns perfectly with what we're trying to do here, fostering a deeper, more thoughtful understanding of these complex topics. So for those of you listening, if you thought you knew the story of Jack the Ripper, we hope this deep dive into Hallie Rubenhold's The Five has given you a new way of looking at it.
I think it raises a big question for all of us. How often, whether we're looking at history or even current events, how often do we get so focused on the perpetrator that we forget about the victims, the people who were harmed, and the bigger societal context that led to that harm?
It's a really crucial point. Imagine how differently we might understand things if we shifted our focus. Whether it's historical analysis, news reporting, whatever. What if we moved away from the actions of the perpetrator and centered the stories and the vulnerabilities of the
It
victims?
would change everything.
It really would. It would make us look beyond the sensationalism and really engage with the human stories at the heart of it all.
Exactly.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We hope this has sparked some further thought and exploration for you.
Me too. This is a conversation that needs to keep going.